14:07 hours. August 12, 1940. 18,300 feet over the Ruhr Valley, Western Germany. Flight Lieutenant David Mercer, age 26, sat hunched over his wireless set in the cramped fuselage of a Royal Air Force Wellington bomber, tail number N2983. He wore an oxygen mask, a fleece-lined Irvin flying jacket, and headphones clamped so tight they left red marks on his skin. Outside, the twin Bristol Pegasus engines droned at 2,600 revolutions per minute, pushing the aircraft along at roughly 200 miles per hour. His job was simple on paper: keep the radio alive, maintain contact with base, and listen. In practice, it meant wrestling with fading signals, German jamming, and the constant thump of anti-aircraft fire reaching up from the ground. At 14:09, a burst of flak detonated 200 feet off the starboard wing. The aircraft shuddered. Black smoke and shards of steel shot past the windows. "Flak, 3 o'clock close!" the rear gunner yelled over the intercom. Mercer adjusted the tuning dial on his R1155 receiver by instinct, nudging it a few kilohertz to clear a whining interference tone. The radio weighed about 25 kilograms, a mass of valves, coils, and wiring. It was his world. Through it came the mission orders, recall signals, and occasionally, the tense voice of a controller warning of enemy fighters. At 14:11, they were already over the outer defenses of the target. Essen. The Krupp works. German heavy industry. Bomb run in 2 minutes, called the pilot, Squadron Leader Harris. Stay sharp. Mercer scribbled the time in his logbook. Thin pencil marks. Routine. He had flown 16 operations before this one. He knew the pattern: climb, cross the coast, flak zone, target, turn, more flak, dash for home. 5 hours out. 5 hours back. If they were lucky. At 14:12, luck ended. A second burst of flak exploded almost level with the fuselage, 50 meters off the port side. One fragment punched through the skin of the aircraft, tearing into the port engine. Oil sprayed. The engine coughed, lost power, then sputtered back at partial throttle. "Port engine hit," the pilot said, voice tight but controlled. Feathering prop. Mercer watched as the propeller blades on the port side slowly turned to reduce drag. One engine down. The Wellington could fly on one, but not at this altitude, not with full bomb load. At 14:13, the first Messerschmitt Bf 109s appeared. Dark shapes, closing fast from above and behind, their Daimler-Benz engines giving them superior speed and climb. They carried 20mm MG/FF/M cannons and 7.92mm machine guns, designed to kill bombers. "Bandits, 6 o'clock high!" shouted the rear gunner, already firing his twin .303 Browning machine guns. Empty cartridge cases rattled into the fuselage. Mercer kept one ear on the intercom, one on the radio. The headset crackled with German ground stations, Luftwaffe fighter control chatter, and RAF broadcasts. He tried to send a brief contact report, but interference and engine noise swamped the transmission. At 14:14, the first fighter attack came in. A Messerschmitt Dove, fired, and broke away. 20mm rounds tore across the fuselage. One shell detonated near the midsection, ripping open a jagged hole 2 feet wide in the aircraft's skin. Mercer felt the shock like a punch in the chest. The lights blinked. One of his radio valves shattered, spraying glass across the panel. "Radio's hit," he said automatically, checking connections, fingers moving fast, trying to keep it alive. He knew the equipment by heart. The R1155 receiver, the T1154 transmitter, frequency ranges, power settings, quirks. He had trained for months on them. That knowledge kept men alive. It also made him a target. Another pass. More fire. At 14:16, the starboard wing took a direct hit. Fuel lines ruptured. A sheet of flame surged outwards. "We're on fire," Harris said. "Prepare to bail out." Repeat, "Prepare to bail out." Mercer looked down at the radio one last time. The set, battered and scorched, still hissed faintly. Somewhere underneath the noise, a voice was speaking English. It didn't matter. He unclipped his harness, grabbed his parachute pack, and clipped it to the chest hooks with practiced hands. At 14:17, the order came. "Jump, jump, jump." Mercer moved to the hatch. The inside temperature dropped sharply as the door opened. Wind roared into the fuselage at over 150 miles per hour. He could see the ground, a patchwork of fields and factory roofs, more than 3 miles below. He hesitated for half a second. Not from fear of falling, but from the knowledge that this step was a one-way door. If he landed in Germany, the war would stop for him, but the danger would not. He stepped out. The shock of the chute opening at around 12,000 feet punched the harness into his shoulders. The burning Wellington shrank above him, trailing smoke, still moving east. Within seconds, it broke apart. One wing folded, then the fuselage rolled, nose down, and vanished into a distant fireball. By 1425, Mercer was dropping through 5,000 feet. German rural countryside spread below. Fields. A small river. A road. He saw civilians pointing up, running. He hit the ground hard at 1428, in a plowed field approximately 20 kilometers northwest of Essen. The parachute dragged him a few meters before collapsing. He unclipped it, rolled onto his back, and listened. Dogs. Shouting. A truck engine starting. He tried to run, but the field offered no cover. Within minutes, a group of armed men approached. 2 Wehrmacht soldiers with Karabiner 98K rifles. 1 policeman. An officer in a gray-green uniform. They surrounded him, shouting in German. Mercer raised his hands. His sidearm, a standard-issue Webley Mk 4.38 revolver, stayed in its holster. Firing it here would be pointless. He was outnumbered, and he knew the rules of the air war. Downed aircrew were prisoners, not partisans. At least in theory. At 15:02, he was in the back of a truck, wrists tied, heading toward a local barracks for interrogation. His flying kit had been stripped away. They had taken his logbook, his radio notebook, even the pencil. The only thing he kept was the compact knowledge in his head. Frequencies, circuits, signal behavior. That would prove more valuable than anything he carried. 2 days later, on August 14, 1940, after a chain of holding cells and a brief, hostile interview by Luftwaffe intelligence, Mercer was placed on a train with dozens of other captured airmen. They traveled east, past cities whose names blurred together, until the landscape flattened and the air grew colder. On August 18, at 9:47, the train shuddered to a halt at a siding lined with barbed wire and wooden watchtowers. A sign at the gate read, in black paint, Kriegsgefangenen Mannschaft Stammlager Luft IV. Stalag Luft IV. It was one of several camps built to hold Allied airmen. Rows of single-story wooden barracks, each around 40 meters long, stood behind double fences. Guard towers spaced every 150 meters. Floodlights. Machine guns. German guards in field gray uniforms carrying 7.92 mm MP-40 submachine guns. They took his name, rank, and number. Flight Lieutenant David Mercer. Service number 412869. He walked into Barrack 7 at 10:23 hours, carrying a thin blanket and a tin mug. The barrack smelled of sweat, coal dust, and boiled cabbage. Triple-tier bunks filled the room. More than 200 men packed into a space designed for perhaps half that. Over the next weeks, the pattern of his new reality formed. Roll call at 6 o'clock in the yard. Thin soup and black bread. Long hours of boredom. Occasional Red Cross parcels. Letters that took months to arrive. News of the outside war filtered through rumor, new prisoners, and the rare smuggled scrap of a German newspaper. By November 1940, Mercer had been a prisoner for 3 months. His war, from a combat perspective, was over. But another kind of mission was forming in his mind. He watched how men changed when they knew nothing. Hope rose and fell on rumor alone. A whispered, "London still holds," lifted 2,000 men. A rumor of invasion or defeat crushed them. At 19:30 on November 6, 1940, lights out in the barracks, Mercer lay on the middle tier of his bunk, listening to the breathing of 100 exhausted men. The camp fell quiet, apart from the occasional bark of a guard dog and the crunch of boots on gravel outside. He stared into the dark and thought of the radio in the Wellington. The coils, the valves, the dial. The invisible waves that carried voices across continents. The Germans had taken his equipment. They had not taken his understanding. A single thought formed. Small at first, Reckless. Then solid. If he could build even the simplest receiver, a crystal set, from scraps, he could pull Allied news out of the air. Not for command. Not for bombing missions. For them. For the 2,000 men crammed behind the wire. A radio, in a prisoner-of-war camp, under the eyes of armed guards, was not just illegal. It was a threat. If discovered, the Germans could lock them in solitary, cancel Red Cross parcels, or worse. He measured the risk against the emptiness inside the barracks when rumors died. By 2003, as the last muttered conversation faded, David Mercer had made his decision. He would build a radio. 6:02 hours. November 9, 1940. Stalag Luft IV, East Prussia. Frost clung to the barbed wire and wooden posts. The temperature hovered just above freezing. The men formed up in rows of 5 for morning roll call, breath white in the air. Guards paced with slung 7.92 mm carabiner 98K rifles, boots crunching on the frozen ground. Flight Lieutenant David Mercer stood in the second row of Barak 7's formation. Thin greatcoat, wool cap, no gloves. His mind wasn't on the cold. It was on a simple question that had kept him awake most of the night. Where exactly in this camp could you hide a radio? The Germans knew the danger. Radios were forbidden. Punishments were explicit. Solitary confinement, withdrawal of Red Cross parcels, sometimes transfer to a harsher camp. Every barack had been searched multiple times since the first Allied airmen arrived. The guards knew to check under floorboards, inside mattresses, behind wall panels. At 6:15, the camp commandant, an oberst with a rigid back and a scar across his jaw, finished the count. Satisfied, he barked an order. Men were dismissed. They filed back toward the barracks, shoulders hunched, eyes down. Inside Barak 7, at 6:23, Mercer stood in the center aisle and looked up and around like a man seeing the room for the first time. Triple-tier bunks. Bare plank walls. A central iron stove with a flue rising through the roof. 2 crude tables. Benches. A few shelves. He started with the stove. By 6:40, he had quietly examined the base and the flue collar. The iron was solid, bolted to the floor. No hidden compartment there. The bunks, though, were different. Each frame was made of rough timber and steel angle brackets, held together with screws and wire. At 7:02, while most of the barack ate thin bread and ersatz coffee, Mercer slid his fingers along a bunk post near the back wall. His nail caught on a hairline crack where 2 boards met. He pressed lightly. The panel flexed. He noted it. A gap behind the wall, between the barack interior and the outer cladding. Maybe 10 centimeters deep. It ran the full length of the building. Big enough. He sat back down at the table, tearing his bread into small pieces. Across from him sat Flight Sergeant Colin Mackenzie, a Scottish navigator from 15 Squadron, captured in July. Age 29. Sharp, tired eyes. "You're measuring the walls with your brain again," Mac said quietly. "What are you thinking, Sparks?" Mercer had earned the nickname Sparks from his trade, not his personality. He hesitated, then spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "A radio," he said. "A small one. No power needed. Just a crystal set. Enough to hear London at night." Mac stared at him. No smile. No joke. "You serious?" "Yes." "How?" "They took everything." "Not everything," Mercer said. "There's metal everywhere in this place. Wire. Razor blades. We need a coil, a detector, a tuning capacitor, and something to listen with. That's all." Between 8:10 and 11 o'clock, while the camp went through its routine, latrine duties, parcel distribution, work details, Mercer walked. Slowly, casually, from one end of Stalag Luft IV to the other. He studied the place like a technician inspecting a broken machine. The perimeter fence carried signal wires for the searchlights and towers. Too dangerous. The kitchen had old pots and broken utensils. Useful metal, but heavily controlled. The real opportunity lay in the men's personal kits. At 11:23, back in Barak 7, Mercer quietly spoke to an older sergeant, a pre-war electrician, who had fixed a broken lamp with stolen wire. By 12:05, he had identified 3 potential sources of key components. Wire, scavenged from broken bed springs, electric lamp cords, or the fine copper inside discarded German headphones or field telephone cable. Detector, a common foxhole solution, using a blued razor blade and a piece of pencil lead as a crude diode detector. The non-corroded steel and carbon contact could rectify radio signals. Earpiece. The hardest part. A high-impedance earphone or a telephone earpiece from a damaged German field set, if one could be obtained or traded from a cooperative guard. At 1340, during midday soup, a thin barley mixture, the first opportunity arrived. A British sergeant at the far end of the table complained that his razor was ruined. A cheap German DE blade, blued steel, edges chipped. Mercer's ears caught the word razor like a signal tone. When the meal ended at 1355, he intercepted the man near the stove. "If you're throwing that razor away," Mercer said quietly, "I'll take it." The man shrugged. "You can have it, mate. Bloody thing couldn't cut fog." Mercer slipped the blade into his pocket. One component down. At 1620, an even more important lead surfaced. A Canadian pilot, John Wilcox, mentioned that a guard had lost his temper near the wire that morning and smashed a field telephone unit against a post. The casing had cracked. Something inside had clattered onto the ground before the guard kicked it aside. By 1703, Mercer and Mack stood near that section of fence during evening exercise. Snow had melted into mud. They walked slowly, heads down, pretending to talk about home. At 1707, Mack stopped, accidentally dropping his tin mug. As he bent to pick it up, his hand brushed against something half buried in the mud, a small, round, black object with two screw terminals. An earpiece. He palmed it, slid it up his sleeve, then into his pocket in one smooth motion. Back in the barack at 1724, behind the semi-privacy of a bunk, they examined it. A standard German telephone earpiece, likely from a Feldfernspreccher 33 field telephone. Impedance around 2,000 ohms. Exactly what they needed. "Now we're in business," Mercer said. Between 1800 hours and 1930, they worked out the rest of the plan. They needed around 20 to 30 meters of insulated copper wire for a tuning coil, a variable capacitor to tune different frequencies, a stable, hidden mounting for the detector and coil, a safe, concealed location close to an external wall to act as an antenna. They would scavenge the wire bit by bit. Each time a lamp broke or a bed spring snapped, they would be there. For a capacitor, Mercer proposed a simple parallel plate design. Thin metal sheets, from food tins, separated by wax paper or oiled paper, stacked and connected to form adjustable capacitance. At 1948, lights out approached. Mercer lay in his bunk, hands behind his head, counting the approximate wavelengths of known broadcast stations. BBC European service in the medium wave band. Several hundred kilometers away. At night, skywave propagation improved. Signals bounced off the ionosphere. A crystal set, with a long enough wire hidden under the roof boards, could pick it up. He would aim for signals in roughly the 200 to 400 kHz long wave and 500 to 1600 kHz medium wave ranges. Crude tuning, but enough. Days turned into weeks. 1910 hours. December 4th, 1940. A guard's careless repair to a barack light left a coil of spare wire on the floor. Mercer tripped over it, apologized, and handed most of it back, keeping a 2-meter length in his sleeve. 11:32 hours. December 12th, 1940. A Red Cross parcel's metal T-tin, once emptied, became the source for capacitor plates. Mercer and Mack cut it with a sharpened spoon and a piece of hacksaw blade smuggled from the maintenance shed. 15:06 hours. December 20th, 1940. 2 bed springs broke under the weight of a large sergeant. While others laughed, Mercer quietly collected the pieces. Inside each spring was steel, but wrapped around the frame he found thinner, rusted wire that, when carefully stripped, yielded usable lengths for the tuning coil. By December 23rd, at 2140, with snow blowing against the barack walls and the camp in semi-darkness, they assembled the first version. They chose the gap behind the wall panel near Mercer's bunk. Working by touch and with a single shaded light, they wound the coil, approximately 80 turns of copper wire around a 6 cm diameter cardboard tube cut from a food parcel. This gave them an inductance suitable for medium wave. Mounted the razor blade detector, Fastened to a small wooden block, one edge blued and slightly corroded, the pencil lead mounted on a flexible wire so it could lightly touch different spots on the blade to find a sweet spot. Attach the homemade capacitor. 12 tinfoil plates separated by paper, stacked and linked alternately to two terminals, forming a crude but functional variable capacitor when plates were added or removed. Wired the German earpiece across the detector output. For an antenna, they used the longest concealed path they could manage. Over several days, Mercer had quietly fed a thin wire up the inside of the wall gap and along the roof beam, reaching nearly the length of the barack, about 30 meters. For a ground connection, they attached another wire to a metal water pipe that ran under the floor. At 22:07, they were ready to test. The barack was mostly quiet. Snores, low whispers, the creak of boards. Outside, the wind masked small sounds. Mercer pressed the earpiece to his right ear. His left hand steadied the coil connection. His right hand gently shifted the pencil lead across the razor blade, feeling for the point where the oxide layer acted as a primitive semiconductor. First, nothing. Just faint hiss. Then, at 22:13, a whisper. A carrier tone. Faint, but real. He adjusted the improvised capacitor by removing two plates, decreasing capacitance, shifting the resonance upward in frequency. At 22:17, the hiss broke into something structured. Human speech. Trembling, thin, distorted by the crude detector, and unmistakably English. London, tonight, enemy activity reported. He froze. The voice was just above the noise threshold. Male, steady, the clipped cadence of a BBC announcer. Mac watched his face. Anything, he whispered. Mercer nodded slowly, eyes closed. Yes. London. He passed the earpiece to Mac for 10 seconds. Any longer risked noise or attention. Mac listened, jaw tightening, then handed it back. Bloody hell, Mac breathed. You've done it. Over the next 15 minutes, Mercer tuned as precisely as the crude components allowed. Snatches of sentences emerged. Convoy in the North Atlantic. RAF fighters engaged. Prime Minister Churchill stated. He couldn't catch every word. It didn't matter. The most important message was implicit. London was broadcasting. Britain was still in the fight. At 22:34, he disconnected the antenna by unscrewing a hidden join behind the panel. The circuit went dead. He wrapped the earpiece in cloth, tucked it into a small cavity under his bunk slat, and replaced the panel. The first night, only 3 men knew. Mercer, Mac, and the electrician sergeant who had helped route the antenna. The next morning, at 6:18, standing in the cold for roll call, Mercer relayed the essence of what he had heard to a trusted flight lieutenant in the next row. London is broadcasting. Convoys still running. Churchill sounded firm. By 8 o'clock, without anyone uttering the word radio, the news had spread through almost every barack. 2,000 men walked a little straighter. The soup was still thin. The fences were still high. But something invisible had crossed those fences at 22:17 the previous night. For David Mercer, the mission had just begun. Now, the challenge shifted. He had to keep the radio alive, improve its reception, and build a distribution network for information. While the Germans, sooner or later, would start to suspect that something inside the wire was listening to voices far beyond their control. 21:46 hours. December 28, 1940. Barack 7, Stalag Luft IV. The barack lights had been out for 16 minutes. Guards walked their perimeter routes every half hour. Mercer knew the pattern. Boots near Barack 5 at 21:50, near Barack 7 at 21:56, then silence for 10 minutes. At 21:47, lying on his bunk, he quietly tapped the underside of the slat twice. A prearranged signal. Mac, on the bunk above, shifted his weight, then dropped lightly to the floor at 21:49. To anyone half awake, it sounded like a man going to the latrine. Instead, he crouched by the wall panel. At 21:50, as boots crunched past outside, Mac slid 2 loosened nails from the panel edge, swung it out just enough to reach in, and connected the antenna lead. Mercer lay still, watching the shadow of a guard tower light sweep across the ceiling. At 21:52, with the guard's footsteps fading, Mercer pressed the German earpiece to his ear again. The coil, detector, and capacitor were fixed now, mounted securely on the wood block behind the wall. Only the antenna and ground wires moved. He rotated the coil slightly on its cardboard tube, fine-tuning the coupling. The hiss of atmospheric noise rose and fell. He brushed the pencil lead across the razor blade until, at 21:55, a carrier signal emerged. The BBC European service often transmitted news at the top of the hour. Nighttime allowed long-range propagation. With their roughly 30-meter wire, makeshift ground, and crude detector, they could sometimes hear London as early as 21:50. Other nights, the ionosphere shifted, and they fought for every syllable. At 21:57, the noise thinned. A voice cut through. "We interrupt this program to bring you a communique from the Air Ministry." Mercer barely breathed. The announcer's words came in fragments, separated by fading and static. He caught key phrases. Heavy raids over London, damage, civilian casualties. Not good news, but real. He listened for the RAF details. Fighters of Fighter Command, significant enemy losses. No break in resistance anticipated. At 22:03, he disconnected the antenna. 10 minutes was their self-imposed limit. The longer they listened, the greater the chance a guard, a squeaky floorboard, or a careless whisper would give them away. At 22:05, the panel was back in place. The antenna wire, once again, vanished into the wall. At 6:12 the next morning, December 29, 1940, Mercer stood at roll call, flanked by men in worn greatcoats. As the German NCO stalked down the line counting heads, Mercer quietly relayed the previous night's broadcast to a lieutenant on his left. "London hit hard," he murmured, lips barely moving. "But fighters held. No talk of surrender." The lieutenant nodded once, face expressionless. At 7:40, during breakfast, that same information, compressed into simple, repeatable lines, circulated across Barrack 7. By 10:30, via coded chit-chat in the yard and at the camp chapel hut, almost every Allied prisoner in Stalag Luft IV had heard some version of it. Not all details survived the retelling, but the core message did. Britain still fought. The government still broadcast. The RAF still flew. By January 1941, Mercer's role had shifted from mere technician to something else, a silent node in an information network. The system developed on its own, shaped by risk. At 18:15 on January 3, 1941, a small group gathered around a table in Barrack 7. 5 men. One from each of the main national groups: British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealander, and Polish. They spoke in low tones. "Every night is too risky," Mac said. "We should set fixed days. Maybe 3 times a week." "And we can't spread raw fragments," the Canadian added. "We need a briefing every morning. Short, clear, no embellishment." They agreed. The radio would operate primarily on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday nights, between 21:45 and 22:05. Mercer would listen, sometimes with one assistant, and write a concise summary of what he heard in a small, coded notebook disguised as a personal diary. At 6:30 the following morning, each representative would receive a verbal briefing of no more than 2 minutes. They would then repeat the key points in their own barracks, using casual conversation, card games, and exercise periods as cover. They called it, half-jokingly, the Camp News Service. No one laughed when the name stuck. The radio itself evolved. On February 19, 1941, at 14:08, a German electrician inspected the Barrack wiring and replaced a failed light fitting. The old fixture, tossed briefly into a bucket, contained a damaged variable capacitor. Mercer's trained eye caught it. At 14:12, he accidentally kicked the bucket, spilling its contents. In the confusion, a small metal plate variable capacitor, rated for radio frequencies, vanished into his sleeve. By 21:30 that night, the homemade tinfoil capacitor was gone, replaced by the German unit. Tuning sharpened. Signals grew clearer. Mercer could now distinguish multiple stations by frequency, briefly checking German broadcasts to confirm events mentioned on the BBC. He kept notes, dates, times, frequencies, signal strength. Those notes, written in a code based on misdated football scores and fictitious family names, looked like harmless personal trivia to any casual observer. The Germans were not casual. On April 2, 1941, at 9:02, the first major search hit Barak 7. 60 prisoners stood outside in the yard while 8 guards and 2 Feldgendarmerie military police entered the barack. The search lasted 70 minutes. Mattresses were slashed. Floorboards pried up. Lockers emptied. At 9:36, a corporal tapped on the wall panel near Mercer's bunk. It sounded hollow. He narrowed his eyes and reached for his bayonet. Mercer watched from the line, heart pounding. The radio sat behind that panel. Coil. Detector. Capacitor. Earpiece hidden elsewhere, but the core was there. At 9:37, the corporal wedged the bayonet into the crack, and stopped. Another guard shouted from the far end. They had found a hoard of contraband cigarettes and a hidden deck of cards with escape maps printed faintly on them. The corporal left the panel and joined the others, more interested in the obvious illicit goods. The wall remained untouched. At 10:12, the search ended. Nothing electronic had been found. That afternoon, at 15:40, Mercer and Mack dismantled the entire set. By 16:25, the coil was hidden inside a hollowed table leg, the detector mounted beneath the removable base of the central stove, and the capacitor concealed behind a loose brick in the latrine wall. The antenna connection point remained behind the panel, but now it linked to components scattered across 3 different hiding spots. "You've made it harder on yourself," Mack observed, watching Mercer reconnect the test leads that night. "Better hard than confiscated," Mercer replied. The set still worked. The signal was weaker due to longer internal leads, but acceptable. It was now modular. If the Germans found one part, the whole system would not be exposed. Years passed. 23:02 hours. November 7, 1942. Mercer, now 28, thinner but still sharp-eyed, tuned the coil and heard the first BBC mention of Allied landings in North Africa. Operation Torch. He did the math in his head. American forces were now fighting on land against the Germans. The next morning, at 6:35, when he briefed the national representatives, men grinned for the first time in weeks. The war was expanding in the Allies' favor. 21:58 hours. February 4, 1943. The Camp News Service carried word, again from London, of a major German surrender at Stalingrad. 6th Army gone. The Eastern Front had turned. That day's message, boiled down and passed from bunk to bunk, was simple. They've lost an entire army in Russia. They can be beaten. In response, German camp staff became jumpier. Radios were rumored. Rumors attracted the Gestapo. On May 12, 1943, at 10:17, 2 plainclothes officers arrived at Stalag Luft IV. They wore civilian coats over military-cut uniforms, pistols under their jackets. Their questions to the commandant were brief. Their gaze, when it swept the yard, was cold. At 11:05, Mercer watched from a distance as the Gestapo men inspected a different barack. They confiscated a small crystal receiver badly hidden under a bunk and hauled 3 men away to the camp jail. Mercer took the lesson hard. Sloppy positioning. Observable behavior. Too many listeners. That night, at 20:40, he cut operating time to 5-minute windows. 21:50 to 21:55. 22:10 to 22:15. Never the same pattern 2 nights in a row. He began to skip sessions entirely if guard routines seemed off. The network adapted. By late 1943, the war's tide turned more visibly. Allied bombing increased. Columns of smoke on clear days marked distant cities under attack. Prisoners arriving from shot-down bombers brought fresh rumors of 4-engined heavies, Lancasters, B-17s, B-24s, hitting the Reich in growing numbers. The Camp News Service validated, corrected, or contradicted those rumors. On June 10, 1944, at 6:28, Mercer quietly passed on one of the most important messages yet. Landings in France. Large scale. Normandy beaches. British, American, Canadian troops ashore. Fighting continues, but they've got a foothold. The information was 1 day old by the time it reached Stalag Luft IV. 4 prisoners with no other reliable source. It felt like a door opening. Some men wept openly. Others stared at the ground, gripping tin mugs until their knuckles went white. The idea of Allied troops back on the continent changed everything. But as the Allies advanced, So did another force, the front line itself. By January 1945, Soviet forces pushing west threatened the region around Stalag Luft IV. On January 25, 1945, at 3:40, guards banged on barack doors with rifle butts. Raus! Alles raus! Marsch bereit! Everyone out! Ready to march! Over the next 2 hours, 2,000 Allied prisoners were ordered to pack what they could carry. Blankets, mess tins, whatever food they had. The camp would be evacuated westward in what would later be called the Long March. At 5:52, in the half-dark of the barack, Mercer faced a decision. The radio, in pieces, still hid in its caches. He could not carry a table leg, a stove base, and a latrine brick on a forced march. He moved fast. At 5:57, he removed the coil from the table leg, unwound it, and wound a smaller version, only 40 turns, around a cardboard cylinder that would fit inside his boot heel. He slipped the razor blade and pencil lead detector into the folded seam of his greatcoat. The variable capacitor was too bulky. He took 2 of its plates and left the rest. The German earpiece, wrapped in cloth for months, went into a sock, then into his pack. At 6:15, when the barack doors finally opened and guards shouted them into the snowy yard, Flight Lieutenant David Mercer stepped out carrying little visible except a thin bundle and a tin mug. Hidden in his clothing were the core elements of the radio that wasn't supposed to exist. The camp behind him would soon be empty. The wire, the towers, the stove, left to the advancing Soviets. The mission was no longer about a single camp. Now, as they began to march west through the dead of winter, it became a question. Could a man still build hope out of scavenged metal and invisible waves while walking, half-starved, across a collapsing Reich? 6:42 hours. January 25, 1945. Road west of Stalag Luft IV, East Prussia. The column stretched for nearly a kilometer. 2,000 Allied airmen, wrapped in blankets and greatcoats, marched in single and double file on a snow-covered road. The temperature sat well below freezing. Breath hung in the air. Boots crunched. Those without boots, the ones in worn shoes or wooden clogs, already limped. German guards walked alongside, rifles slung, MP40s at the ready. A horse-drawn wagon rattled behind them, piled with sacks and a few prisoners too sick to walk. Flight Lieutenant David Mercer walked in the front third of the column. He carried a small pack, 45 centimeters high, 30 wide, containing his blanket, an extra pair of socks, and a tin of condensed milk he'd saved for months. The real value was invisible. The shortened coil in his boot heel, the razor blade and pencil lead sewn into his greatcoat, the German earpiece wrapped in a sock. At 8:15, they cleared the last buildings near the camp and moved into open countryside. Flat fields, lines of bare trees, occasional farms in the distance. The sound of artillery came faintly from the east, dull thumps, rolling echoes. The war was moving. By 10:30, the first man fell. Frostbite and exhaustion. Guards shouted. 2 prisoners helped him up. The column trudged on. Mercer did quiet calculations. Average pace, roughly 3 kilometers per hour, slowed by snow and ice. They had been told nothing about destination, only west. Food issued that morning, a piece of bread, about 200 grams, and a slice of sausage. No guarantee of more. At 12:05, they halted in a roadside clearing for 10 minutes. Men squatted, stamped their feet, ate small bits of frozen bread. Mercer leaned against a tree, flexing his toes around the cardboard cylinder hidden in his boot. The coil stayed intact. He had no illusions. There would be no full-sized radio on this march. No fixed antenna runs. No wall panels. But as long as he had wire, a detector, and the earpiece, the idea of a signal remained. At 17:40, after nearly 11 hours on the road with brief stops, they reached a farm village. The guards herded them into a barn 30 meters long and 12 wide, walls of rough timber, roof tiled and drafty. Straw covered the floor in a thin layer. By 18:10, the doors closed. A single lantern hung from a beam. Men packed in, shoulder to shoulder, breathing hard. The smell of sweat, damp wool, and straw filled the space. At 18:22, Mercer found a spot near the back wall. Mac collapsed beside him, fingers stiff. "We're not marching like this for a day," Mac muttered. This will be weeks. Mercer didn't answer. He was looking up. Horizontal beams ran the length of the barn at about 3 meters height. Nails stuck out at intervals. In the near dark, he could see thin gaps between roof tiles. Antenna points. At 1905, after a watery soup ration, 1 ladle per man, boiled potatoes floating in gray liquid, most of the column settled down. Some slept. Some coughed. Guards stood outside, silhouettes against the faint glow of a farmhouse lamp. At 1922, Mercer slid off his boot. Carefully, under his blanket, he removed the cardboard cylinder with its 40 turns of fine wire. The coil was about 3 centimeters long, 2 in diameter. He unwrapped the sock containing the earpiece, checking the terminals by touch. Then, with chilled fingers, he reached inside the lining of his greatcoat and felt for the seam where he'd hidden the razor blade and pencil lead. Still there. At 1940, he had the components laid out on the straw, shielded from view by Mac's hunched form and a blanket draped like a curtain. No capacitor. That meant crude tuning by changing the coil's effective length and shifting the contact point. It would not be efficient. We're really doing this here? Mac whispered. If I can get anything at all, Mercer said, they'll know the fronts are moving. That's worth it. At 1943, he took the risk. He stripped 20 centimeters of wire from the coil's end using a sharpened nail and his teeth. This would serve as both lead and improvised slider for tuning. He connected the coil's main ends to the earpiece and detector, antenna side to razor blade, earpiece and pencil lead to ground return. It was technically a very basic tune detector circuit, inductor, detector, and load in series, antenna and ground loosely coupled by direct connection. Now, he needed an antenna. At 1952, with the barn dim and most men lying down, he folded the coil and detector into his coat pocket, leaving only the antenna wire loose. He climbed onto a hay bale, then onto a lower beam, hands numb on the rough wood. Every creak sounded loud. At 1955, he reached a horizontal beam about 2.5 meters off the ground. Continuing higher would draw attention. He looped the stripped wire around a protruding nail, tying it off in 2 quick, practiced motions. The bare metal contact turned the beam into a crude support for the antenna wire that lay against it. It wasn't ideal, but better than nothing. He dropped back down at 1958, easing into the straw. Done, he whispered. At 2010, wrapped in his blanket, he pressed the earpiece into his right ear and cradled the detector in his palm. The antenna lead ran up his sleeve to the beam. The other side of the circuit, ground, was a problem. He solved it by wrapping the return wire around a rusty iron staple embedded in the barn's wall near the floor. Moist straw and earth provided a minimal ground path. He moved the pencil lead across the razor blade surface, feeling the faintest change in resistance. At 2018, the hiss of atmospheric noise whispered into his ear. Faint, weak, but present. He shortened the effective coil by pinching the wire halfway along its length, changing the inductance. The noise shifted. A thump from outside. Guard checking the doors. Mercer froze. Hand steady. At 2022, just as he considered abandoning the attempt for the night, a pattern emerged from the noise. Not a voice. Not words. A carrier tone with a slow, regular fading pattern. It hinted at a broadcast station near the edge of his improvised tuning. He shifted his grip by a centimeter. At 2024, the noise broke into something structured. Weak, distorted, nearly swamped by fading, but unmistakably human speech in English. Allied forces continued their advance today. He closed his eyes. On the Western Front, fighting reported near the Ardennes. News of the Ardennes counteroffensive. Probably days old, but vital. It meant American forces were still pushing east despite German resistance. He caught only fragments. No details of divisions. No map references. But enough. At 2028, the signal faded completely. Nighttime ionospheric conditions, low antenna height, poor ground, everything worked against him. He tried retuning for another 2 minutes, got only hiss, and stopped. He had what he needed. At 2033, the antenna wire came down in a quick tug. He coiled it, stowed the components, and pulled his blanket tight. At 6:10 the next morning, January 26, 1945, the column formed up again. As men shifted and coughed in the cold, Mercer moved between small knots of prisoners, speaking to the same national representatives that had formed the news service back in the camp. "Western Allies still advancing," he said quietly. "Fighting in the Ardennes area, but London says the push continues." In the context of a freezing forced march, those few words mattered more than an entire newspaper. Days blurred into each other. Snow, ice, frozen ditches, barns and occasionally open fields for shelter. Minimal food, sometimes a crust of bread, sometimes nothing until midday. Feet rotted in wet socks. Men with dysentery staggered off the road, then back on. Whenever they were sheltered in a building with beams, metal, and enough darkness, Mercer repeated his routine. Coil in boot. Detector in coat. Earpiece in sock. Antenna fed up to a nail or wire. 5 to 10 minutes of listening, if he was lucky, to snatch a few phrases from the air. He heard of the Soviet crossing of the Oder. He heard BBC announcers mention converging Allied armies. Once, in late March 1945, he caught a clear line. German forces increasingly on the defensive across all fronts. That sentence alone circulated for 3 days. At 8:47 on April 10, 1945, somewhere in northern Germany, the march abruptly ended. The column rounded a bend to find the road ahead blocked by a charred German truck and an abandoned anti-aircraft gun. In the distance, artillery rumbled, not from the east or far west, but nearby. At 9:12, the guards conferred. Voices rose. One pointed east, another west. A few looked at the prisoners with a mix of fear and resentment. They all understood the same thing. The front was about to overrun them. At 10:05, a sound cut through the air unlike artillery or aircraft. The distinct, rising roar of fast engines in low gear. Tanks. The first Allied armored vehicle, a British Cromwell, turret traversed, 75mm gun elevated slightly, appeared at the far end of the road at 10:13, flanked by infantry with Sten guns and Lee Enfield rifles. White air recognition stars and British unit markings covered their hulls. The German guards hesitated for seconds, then threw their weapons into the ditch. Some ran. Others raised their hands. Prisoners dropped their packs. Some knelt. Others simply stood, stunned. When the British platoon reached them at 10:21, an officer climbed onto the Cromwell's hull and shouted, "You chaps from the camps? You're safe now. You're under Allied control." The words rippled down the column. Men laughed, cried, or just stared. A few who could barely stand gripped each other's shoulders. Mercer felt his legs shaking. 5 years, 1,700 days, since that flak burst over the Ruhr. 4.5 of those years behind wire. Months on the road. Cold. Hunger. Uncertainty. All of it converged into one steady, almost absurd thought. The signals he had chased in the dark were now rolling toward him in steel and gasoline and khaki uniforms. By 1400 hours, they had been moved to a temporary assembly point. Medical teams checked frostbite, malnutrition, and infection. Tea boiled in large metal urns on field stoves. For many, it was the first real hot drink in days. A young British signals officer, seeing the RAF wings on Mercer's tattered tunic, sat beside him at 15:20. "What was your trade?" he asked. "Wireless operator," Mercer replied. "Sets and telegraph. Built some improvised receivers in the camp." The officer raised an eyebrow. "In the camp? Under their noses?" "Yes." "You'll have to write that up," the officer said. "That sort of thing, it keeps men alive more than you'd think." After repatriation in mid-1945, Flight Lieutenant David Mercer returned to Britain weighing barely 60 kilograms. His hair was thinner, his face more lined, but his technical skill remained. By 1947, he moved into a permanent post with the RAF Signals Branch, teaching new generations of wireless operators. His lectures were not just about frequency bands and modulation, but about what information meant to men under pressure. He would describe, in measured tones, how a simple crystal set could be assembled from a blued razor blade and pencil lead as a detector, scavenged wire for a coil, any available length of metal elevated above ground as an antenna, a field telephone earpiece scavenged or traded. He used precise values, approximate inductance, expected signal strengths at night, the benefits and limitations of passive reception. But he always anchored those details in human outcomes. Morale, he would say, tapping the chalk against the blackboard, is often a function of perception, not just calories or temperature. A single confirmed news report can stabilize 200 men. Multiply that by a camp, and you see why the enemy feared radios more than knives. In the 1950s, he left the RAF with the rank of squadron leader and took a civilian engineering job with a radio manufacturer, working on compact receivers and later early transistor sets. He consulted quietly on survival and escape manuals, contributing sections on improvised antennas and passive receivers for downed aircrew. He never saw himself as a hero. In interviews and veteran gatherings, he described his role in plain terms. "I built a radio," he would say. "The men did the hard part. They believed it." Years later, a museum display on Allied prisoners of war included a small exhibit titled, "Hope on the Airwaves: The Secret Radios of the Camps." Behind the glass sat a reconstructed version of Mercer's first Stalag Luft IV set: cardboard coil former, razor blade detector, German earpiece, tin plate capacitor. A diagram showed how each component fit. A caption noted that the set, at its peak, helped maintain morale for up to 2,000 men by relaying news 3 times a week. Next to it, a small plaque carried a quote attributed to squadron leader David Mercer, RAF, RET. "They could take our aircraft. They could take our uniforms. What they couldn't take was the fact that somewhere out there, a voice was still saying, 'This is London.' As long as we could hear that, we were not finished." In the end, his legacy was not a new weapons system, a tactical innovation, or a famous battle. His legacy was proof of something quieter but just as decisive in war. That in the worst conditions humans can endure, behind wire, under guard, half-starved and half-frozen, a few grams of metal, a fragment of carbon, and a length of wire can become more than a radio. They can become a lifeline. And every time a modern military survival course teaches young aircrew how to improvise a receiver from scrap, or a museum guide explains why prisoners risked solitary confinement for a whispered news bulletin, part of his unseen circuit still carries a signal forward, across years instead of miles. A signal that says, "Someone is out there. You are not alone. Hold on."